For those of us who love dragons and were upset that there were absolutely no dragons and shadows over Innistrad, we have a really awesome dragon in this set in the form of Mirrorwing Dragon. This thing might just seem like a big dork of a creature that just sits there for a turn while it allows your opponent to just point removal at it. But keep in mind, if your opponent does point removal at it, it copies that spell for each of your opponent's creatures and will hopefully kill them as well. So vengeance is not always the best thing. This thing may actually sit on the battlefield a turn, and hopefully maybe it can be the first playable constructed dragon that doesn't have haste. While it's usually not going to be quite as impressive as a Wrath of God, Nihiri's Wrath seems like it can see some play, potentially. Although you're going to have to pitch a lot of cards with a lot of high converted mana costs. If you play Modern, you could even pitch Emrakul and do 15 damage to each creature and Planeswalker. That is if you discard enough cards, and there are not that many creatures and Planeswalkers on the battlefield. On second thought, you're probably just better off playing a Wrath effect in that case. Up next, we have assembled Searing Blazes. Alphas. Although this probably will not see play in a constructed format like Standard or Modern, it doesn't seem too bad in a format like EDH, considering no one is really going to want to block it, so it's definitely something to consider if you really want to try to get in there and like to be unblocked and do damage. You can also be defensive and have it sit back and cast Searing Blazes by blocking. Yay, because we just love Searing Blaze. Who doesn't love Searing Blaze? At first glance, Bedlam Reveler seems like it does cost an arm and a leg, but when you realize that getting all these instants and sorceries in your graveyard does not seem like that hard to do, it can probably be a very legitimate threat, especially upon casting. It gets you more cards and it has prowess. So, for example, if you have a whole bin full of instants and sorceries and then played it and for a very low amount of mana and then get those cards and then just knock it in there, just keep beating face. I think this thing has a lot of potential. I really do. It gets you extra cards, gets you extra fuel for your fire. If you play blue, you can play cards that draw you more cards and get more stuff. Granted, it is probably going to be a late game card, but it does have a lot of potential, especially with prowess. And in the right deck, I think this could really bust someone up. Up next, we have Impetuous Ball Lightning. And by that I mean Devils. Personally, I didn't really think that this needed to be sacrificed at the end of turn or have the cost to sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Frankly, just because when you block this thing, it's likely going to die anyway. So I didn't really think that's necessary, and plus we're paying 1 extra mana for it, so I feel like it just doesn't really need that when it's just kind of going on a suicide mission. Nonetheless, 4 mana Ball Lightnings, historically speaking, haven't been that great, so I don't think this is going to be as great as it looks. Although it does have some potential, I don't think it's going to be anything groundbreaking or exciting, simply because first strike creatures just kind of embarrass it. Red also got another stellar Escalade card in the form of Collective Defiance, which does everything from burning a creature, burning a player, and getting you new cards if you don't like your hand. Seems like a wonderful card. I'm gonna be surprised if this doesn't see a whole lot of play in red decks, but then again, a lot of standard players say red is not a really great color. Hopefully this set will change a few things, because there actually are quite a few red cards in the set that I'm pretty excited about, and this is one of them right here. Up next, we have the red Hero of Bladehold, which costs 1 mana less. It's also a gimmicky meld card, but I feel like this card is very playable without the meld cost anyway, or the meld ability anyway. It's just solid, and just attacking with this thing just produces a ton of value. You're just going to have to hope it sticks around, and in Standard, I think this should be pretty easy to do. The Hammer Garrison melts together with the land Hammer Battlements, which ultimately adds an additional mana and gives a creature haste, which can be nice if you play an aggressive deck, but honestly, I feel like their meld form is really powerful. It just basically becomes an even bigger Hero of Bladehold, and it's absolutely terrifying. Personally, I feel like this meld is really good for an aggressive red deck. After all, the land does use red abilities and red creatures, and a 7/4 with trample and haste just is, well, pretty devastating in that sense. Although you will need some mana to use it, it does seem like an excellent finisher, considering you're pumping out 13 power a combat phase. Moving on to some vampires, we have the Stromkirk Occultists, and this thing actually seems like it's another staple for the vampire deck, as we had a lot of vampires that had madness, or madness enablers. This one has madness, and with all the madness enablers I talked about in the black video, it seems like it's very likely red-black vampires could be a deck again in standard. This thing is great because it actually provides you some card advantage, and when with a deck like red-black vampires, even though you may not always get the opportunity to cast the card or play the card depending on what kind of card it is or the situations of that may be in the game, it's probably not going to be too hard to do damage with this thing because it has trample. Bottom line is, I think if there is going to be a red-black vampire deck, this will probably be in it, simply because the black vampires, on the other hand, don't have a lot of way to generate card advantage, and this thing will if it sticks around. Aww, it's a cute little kitty, and he wants to give me a donate. Aww. Moving on to some red ramp here, and an interesting variation of an old mechanic, we have Conduit of Storms, which is just a werewolf being struck by a lightning bolt. Fortunately, it does provide some mana, and if used correctly, we can actually transform it the turn after if we're able to hold off on that mana to pay its cost. It transforms into something that's really, really good at pumping out Eldrazi's, and my goodness, what's going on here? Honestly, I feel like a lot of people are kind of upset with this design choice that Wizards has made, as the werewolves don't really transform the way they should. It's not really flavorful, it's just kind of, it feels less like gothic horror and a lot more like Alien. My big question is, why on earth weren't people like this in Rise of the Eldrazi? Emrakul didn't do this. No one was like turning into like savage Eldrazi. There were no like people turning into Eldrazi's. It doesn't make any sense. Fury Blade Vampire might arguably be a better Ravenous Bloodseeker, considering it's a lot more powerful, has trample, and, well, can arguably do a lot more damage and trade with more things. Although you will only be able to discard one card per combat, well, that's kind of the same case with Ravenous Bloodseeker anyway. Plus, the additional power may give vampires the additional range they need to really get that final blow in there. If you like to play long, grindy games that last a while and play instants and sorceries, then Shreds of Sanity may be the right card for you, as it does give you card advantage if you have an instant and sorcery in your graveyard. What's driving me insane is this card exiling itself. I mean, good grief, you didn't have to go. You were such a great card. Why are you leaving? Next up, I want to talk about Incendiary Flow, and I think everyone who plays Standard has wanted a card like this for quite a while. We've been barren of a card like Lightning Strike or Incinerate for a really long time, and this seems like it's a good card to fill its shoes for now. Basically, this thing is a bit, I guess you could say, a bit better or a bit worse of a Pillar of Flame, depending on how you look at it, but it's nice considering that there are a lot of cards that have potential to come back from the dead, being zombies and everything. Fun fact, I as a human being can cast Incendiary Flow by myself if I eat enough burritos. Smoldering Werewolf seems like a sweet card against lots of decks that use tokens and other little creatures, transforming into a big nasty thing which shocks every time it attacks. This seems actually like a card that a lot of people are kind of overlooking, especially for a matchup like that. It probably won't be great in all constructed matchups, but in those matchups, definitely consider it. Going to the common corner, we have some interesting things like Barred Hostility. This tiny Escalade spell gives a creature a significant pump boost or first strike, or both at the cost of 3 additional mana. Still, this card can be kind of similar to a card like Giant Growth, but considering red is more about power than toughness, it often does the same thing. This card would likely be replacing of a Titan Strength or something like that in some decks. But I feel like it can potentially see some play in aggressive red decks, if not used as a combat trick at times for just the first strike itself. Therma Alchemist seems like a mono-red Electrode, and that's essentially what it is. basically, you won't be able to attack with it, but with 0 power, who cares about attacking? You just want to ping things. Just go poke, 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 and just spam instants to untap it. And it's pretty good in that sense if you can last long enough to abuse that ability. The problem is you can only poke opponents, so you won't be able to really get any creatures, but you will still be able to block them, and it's a pretty good blocker, at least in the early game.